Hi, thank you so much for joining me with my first video. I really hope you enjoy it. The process I begin with when starting a complicated sculpture is I'll make myself a reference, and then on top of this I will draw the bones of the armature that I will be making. Sculptures like this quite often need an armature just because they'll become quite brittle otherwise, and it just helps give you something to work from. And here I'm using the reference to bend my wire into the shapes that I need, and then I'm using masking tape just to attach them together. I will be putting this in the oven, but I've not found any problems with using masking tape inside of my sculptures. Now here I'm using a thinner wire, and I'll wrap it around the main armature. And that's just to give the clay something to adhere to once I start to sculpt, and it also keeps the foil from slipping around, as you'll see in a minute. And I'm also using the reference here just to bend the legs into the correct positions. So I'm using more of that thin wire to wrap the legs. I try to keep it quite thin, as if it's too bulky I won't be able to achieve the level of realism that I'd like. I'm starting to bulk out the armature with some foil. When you're using polymer clay it can get quite bulky and heavy, plus it's quite expensive, so to bulk out the main shapes with foil first is a good way of keeping the sculpture light but also saving money at the same time. And here I'm just using some more of that thin wire just to anchor that main body piece into place. And now, just using my reference, I'm putting lumps of foil just to fill out the shape to reference my sketch. I am using quite a lot of tape here, but I haven't run into any problems using it inside polymer clay sculptures, especially at the temperature that the oven will be at, which is quite low. Now at this point I'm preparing my drill as I make a base for the armature. I've decided that rather than having this sculpture be freestanding, I'd like to have a scene, but also it can help keep unstable sculptures like this upright. And it just makes it easier for me to plan out the shapes and the anatomy and the pose and everything else. Here I'm just marking the legs at the base of the leg length, as I've made the wire longer than the leg actually needs to be so it can slot into the base. And here I'm repositioning the neck so it's a little bit more organic than my source material, which is hard to depict when you're drawing on a flat surface. Now that I'm able to get a top-down view, I'm just using my knowledge of horse anatomy to bulk out the armature. I'm modelling this sculpture from a traditional Argentine polo pony, which is a breed that was created by crossing the Criollo horse with the thoroughbred, which means that the anatomy is a slightly stockier looking thoroughbred. Although I didn't add it in to the video, I just shifted the sculpture back to the rear of the stand as I had it a little bit too close to the front at first. Now when I first baked it, I started by covering the wooden base with foil as I was worried about smoking, but it never smoked, so I don't carry on doing this. And here you can see I'm using liquid clay to cover the armature before putting on the first layers of this cheap clay that I have. I'm using it as a base because I hate working with it and it's quite sticky and it doesn't really hold detail very well. It's just more like working with plasticine if you've ever used that. Now I just squish all the clay down onto the armature to try and remove any air bubbles and then brush it with some clay softener to keep it smooth, and then I bake it. Now after it's been baked, I kind of backtrack a little bit and slice off some of the bulk in places that I realise are a little bit too thick, just to shape the sculpture a little bit better for the next layers, and then my dog wanted to have a look, of course. The head and neck were my main focus as I had made them quite bulky before, and now I'm clearing off my workspace here. And here I move the base just so that I can work on the sort of underside, and I'm using some liquid clay here to attach the first part of my detail, which is the teeth, of course, because where else would you start? And then with this tiny ball stylus I'm just outlining the individual teeth and then putting a bit of detail onto the gums. And then scaling it back again to low detail, I'm just bulking out the face with the base shapes and using a cotton bud just to smooth the edges, as well as my fingers. Pretty much every time I apply clay to the sculpture, I will add some liquid clay first to glue it on. Now you can see I'm still using my reference, and I'm comparing my sculpture to this sketch quite a few times just to make sure the shapes are what I originally planned. Now I don't use many tools, I mostly use my fingers, cotton buds, and also the ball stylus you saw me use, as well as this weird Frankenstein tool that you'll see come in later that I made out of a cotton bud and some pieces of wire. I'm using a cotton bud here just to punch out the eye sockets. And now she's baked, and now I'm adding some extra bits and bobs just to fill in the spaces that I didn't quite get right the first time. You can see me adding a little piece of wire into this shape that I've made, and it's just to give a little bit more stability to the jaw that I'm adding on here. I should have really made a wire coming out of the armature for this, because I had originally planned to make this pony be yawning. As you can see here, it's a little bit gruesome looking, but I didn't, so here I'm just putting it in so that it gives it a little bit more structure than just clay hanging straight off. And here I'm making her tongue, and before I put it in, I just give it a little bit of a softened shape because it's probably not going to be edited after this. Shape up the mouth a bit better and then pop it in, except it was a bit too long so I had to snip off a little bit. And then here it is, looking nice and weird. And then she's baked again, just because I really didn't want to ruin any of that detail. And here I'm applying her top lip and some more of her facial features, comparing against the reference wherever I need. I added the chin on here, smoothing it out with the back of the paintbrush. And then I ignore the face for a little bit and start working on the rest of her body so that I've got a bit more progress than just what I've done on the face before I put it in the oven again. So I try and work on just different areas of the body so that I'm not smashing what I've just done, but I get enough progress in between baking that it doesn't feel like I'm just wasting energy and time. And here I'm using the ball stylus, not to put too much detail in, but just to make sure that the shapes of the muscles and bony bits are established so that I don't have to do quite as much carving later. Now my method of sculpting is a little bit chaotic. I tend to just add little blobs here and there as I go, and quite frustrating to watch back, but it is quite satisfying at the same time just to see the shapes evolving. Just adding on little fillets here and there as I go. It does kind of look like raw chicken. Just making her little chicken wings a bit beefier. I also realised at this point that her face does stay like that for quite a long time, so I apologise for any distress. It does look a bit funny at the moment, but just wanted to make sure that most of the tiny details were done at the end so that I wasn't snapping any of them or chipping any of them as I went. So after I got the base shapes there, I kind of just left it for a while. Now, because her neck is turning towards you at this point, I knew there had to be some wrinkles in the skin. So I made some little snakes of clay and I just lined them up next to each other to make the appearance of some wrinkles. And I just made sure I smoothed them all in with some clay softener. Now, thankfully, the white base layer is slowly disappearing behind this better clay, and I can actually start to put some details into it. While sculpting this, I have about 25 references up that I'm flicking through, just of different parts of the horse's body, just so that I can get a better idea of the details and anatomy. And here I'm adding the ribs and just making sure they're nice and blended in. Now, of course, because this is supposed to be a mammal, both sides are mostly symmetrical, but just for my workflow I tend to mostly prepare one side, and then once that's been baked and I can handle it without worrying about squishing it, I'll turn it over and work on the other side. Before I worked too much on the tail, I did include some certain parts of anatomy, but I didn't include the footage of that, but obviously you'll see bits and bobs as we go along. So now I'm applying some liquid clay into the eye sockets and I'm popping in little eyeballs, and now it looks even more scary. As you can see here, I've finished most of the basic details on the opposite side to what I did before, and here I'm adding some wrinkly bits onto the elbows just because this leg is slightly further back than a neutral position, which means the skin behind the elbow would be slightly creased. Give her a sand after baking her this time, as I'm going to start adding some smaller details, and I want to make sure that the majority of the model is nice and smooth. So here I'm starting to work on her tailbone, and polo ponies quite usually will have either a shaved or plucked tailbone to keep it nice and neat. So here I've done shaved sides and then a pulled top, so there's a bit of hair texture on the top, but it's mostly down to the skin on the sides. And then here I'm just carving some little divots out for where the tape will go, since when in game a polo pony's tail will typically be either knotted up or plaited up and taped to keep it out of the way of the mallet. So now I'm plaiting together 3 long pieces of clay to start to shape out this tail. Once I've finished, I roll up the end and then I just attach it to the tailbone with some liquid clay. And then roll it up, just do some extra hair detailing around the bits that the tape won't be, and then add some clay softener, some liquid clay just to try and bind the pieces together, and then add the divots back where I originally planned them so that I can add the tape later. I found rocking a Q-tip back and forth into this space was a really good way to create a nice smooth divot, and I do this quite often on different parts of the sculpture as well. And then on the other end of the sculpture, so that I don't ruin anything that I've just done, I am applying the mane. And again, polo ponies don't have any long hair really, so that it keeps out of the way of the gameplay. So most polo ponies will be hogged, which is the term for shaving the mane away, or in America I think they call it roaching. I'm adding on some muscles in the neck and then just buffing in the mane. So some do and some don't, but quite a lot of the pictures in the polo ponies that I have ridden personally have had a little tuft of their mane left at the base of the neck, quite just on top of their withers, and that's either used as a handle by the player or just a little bit of embellishment. I'm not really sure, but I thought it was a nice detail to add in. Where I've added little pieces of clay on top of the main base but haven't blended them in as such, I make sure I add some liquid clay on top of them just to help anchor them into place. Now I've baked her again, and this time I'll be adding the tape that I mentioned, just some very thin flat pieces of clay, and just wrapping them round inside the divots that I made. If I hadn't made spaces for this tape to go, the tail would have ended up looking really bulky, and it already looks quite bulky anyway, so I wanted to make sure that there was a sort of pinched effect where the tape was physically pinching the hair and making it look slightly more textured. And now I'm adding a little bit more detail to the top of the neck where the mane was, and because there's no hair there, there's just sort of stubble. The way that I found best to add that was to use this little stamp that I made and then the ball stylus. Here's some milliput, which is a 2-part epoxy clay which you can mix together and it hardens without the use of heat. So I'm putting this on the legs because one of the things that usually happens whenever I make sculptures with long thin legs is that at some point along the leg it will snap, just from handling or the weight of the body. And this sculpting medium is a lot harder than the polymer clay and it doesn't crack as easily. And I do sculpt on top of it with some polymer clay. This medium is safe to be heated up to 130 degrees Celsius, which is what I bake my sculptures at anyway. This was a good first test for that because of the lack of detail on the legs as I baked it for the first time, and I didn't see any problems. The important thing is just to make sure that it's fully cured before it goes into the oven, otherwise the heat could cause it to crack or to expand in a certain way. The curing time for this one was 3 hours minimum, but I was working on this late at night anyway, so I just left it overnight and carried on in the morning. So yeah, so you can see I'm sculpting on top of it with this polymer clay, and I was wondering if there would be any cracking in the join between the polymer clay and the milliput, but over the entire sculpture I never see any cracks. At this point you can start to see the legs are taking shape. I try to add a little and often rather than do one big pass and do a bit on each leg at the same time, just to avoid my consistency in my style changing and to make sure they all end up the same sort of width. I don't want, one leg to be really thick and another one to be really thin. So as you see, I'm going back and forth between the legs just to make sure that it's consistent. And because I was working on this sculpture over the course of a couple of weeks, obviously there is margin for slight changes in my style or my skills in that time, which seems crazy, but it is true. At this point I noticed the front legs looked a little bit strange and far apart, and I realised it's because I missed out a big muscle that goes from the inside of the forearm up to the pectoral muscles, so I just added that in. And suddenly it looked a lot more normal. And then I baked her and gave her a sand before I carried on with the next lot of details. So I think at this point it would be a good idea to work on the head, as it does look a little bit different from the rest of the body. So here you can see I'm adding the lower lip around the bottom of that tongue, and already it starts to look slightly less demented. And I'm adding on 2 little balls for the nostrils, adding some clay softener, and then I use my soft Q-tip just to blend that into a little hole, and then use my tiny ball stylus to add some detail. Now, I don't think I've ever created any art of a horse actively yawning, so this was quite a challenge for me, but I just made sure I had lots of references and I picked cute ones so that it didn't look scary. And then I didn't have anything to put her on, so I just used this. Here I'm adding some liquid clay just as a base to sculpt my tiny details onto, as it makes it a little bit easier to get it to stick, so I don't have to blend them quite as hard as I would have done. Now I give her a lovely moustache. It's definitely not the corner of her mouth. Now it's time to tame those slightly disturbing looking eyes. I want her to look like her eyes are mostly closed but just slightly open because she's in the middle of a yawn. It does take me a little bit of back and forth to get this to a point where I'm happy with it, but the end result, I think, turned out how I planned originally. I'm using the point of a scalpel blade to really finely cut in the details of the eyelids, as the ball stylus I had wasn't quite small enough. I take off the base and do some work underneath, just extending any muscles that I haven't quite gotten right yet. Of course, nobody's really going to be looking at this part of the horse, but a lot of the time when I make artwork I try to make every single piece of it viewable. So even though the viewing angle for this is probably going to be ground level from the base, I like to make sure that I'm happy with each angle of the sculpture, so I'm proud of the whole piece. I don't usually like to have a bad side for the sculptures I make. I want every angle to be viewable. When in play, polo ponies typically wear bandages on their legs, so here I'm just sculpting out the basic shapes of what the bandage will look like, and then I'm going in and adding any lines that need to be added to imply a wrapped bandage. Originally I did actually take a long piece of clay and try and wrap the bandage around, but it ended up looking too bulky, so I didn't include that footage as this video is way too long already. Now before I add the creases, I'm cutting out the end of the bandage here, and it's usually in a little arrow shape pointing towards the back of the horse, and it's usually where the Velcro is that just finishes off the wrap, and I make a couple more for the other bandages later, and here I'm putting on the detail that I mentioned. Now I add a little bit of clay softener and then I dab the whole thing with some foil just to add texture, and then I use the side of a Q-tip to make another groove. Now I'm back to the face again, adding the ends of the nostrils and blending those into the rest of the face. Everything is obviously much more exaggerated than it usually would be, as you know, a yawn makes your face look a bit funny, so that's why I'm trying to make sure I'm closely referencing the pictures that I have up on my monitor as I sculpt. And then I'm just adding on the forelock as the end of the mane. Now I'm using a long wormy bit of clay and I'm just doing the outside of the ears, and then I'm just blending them in with the tiny ball stylus again. Those are done, and then I use the Q-tip to make another groove and then bake her, and then you'll see why I've added a groove here. I carve out a little bit of the top of the neck because it would have been too bulky otherwise, and then I start to apply pieces of clay to make a rope halter. The traditional polo halter is a bit of a strange shape. I tried to replicate it as much as I could here. I've twisted 2 long pieces of clay together to make a rope, and then obviously I've used that chopped up to make the halter. And then these little balls that I've been adding are the knots at the end of each piece of the halter. I make some small eyelets with some wire on the end of the paintbrush, and I put them aside for later. They're just part of the halter that I can't add just yet. So while I've worked on the face, I go back to the legs before baking, and I'm making the bandages on the front legs. But you'll see later that I am not happy with these and I end up doing something a bit different. So here's why I made the groove in the bandages, because they tend to tape those up as well to prevent them from slipping when they're in play. And then I realised that I messed up the halter, because on this side, on the left side of the horse's face, there is a little attachment for where the bottom part of the halter wraps up around its jaw and then slots a little knot into that groove that I've just made. And hopefully I've managed to replicate that. So now it's time to work on the rest of the tack, even though I haven't finished the base sculpture because I can't seem to stay on top it very long. So here I'm making a saddle blanket, and I'm making sure I add clay softener and glue to stick it to the rest of the body, and then I lay it over and press some fabric into it to create some texture. And then obviously gravity works differently in miniature, so I just tidy up the edges to make it look right, and then make a little clearance between the wither and the blanket. And then I'm cutting out the base shape of the saddle just to cut out where it's going to lie on the blanket, just to make sure again that it doesn't end up too bulky, and I end up doing it slightly off centre, so I make sure to correct that before I go too far. Just tidy up the edges and then try and blend it in a little bit so that it's not quite such a harsh cut line. And then I just make sure I've made the texture all over it, even on bits I've changed. I wrap a piece of paper around the girth of the horse just to make sure I have it in the right position, and then I cut a groove for the girth later. And then at this point I decided I wanted to add a little bit on top of the withers, so I added that as well. And then here I'm adding some liquid clay to the girth, and then here is my actual girth that I sculpted out of clay and not paper this time. And I just make sure I add some lovely details that I entirely cover up later. And then add some more liquid clay, the little piece that I made to replicate the base of the saddle, and then brush it all with liquid clay to make sure it's nice and stuck so that when it's baked it isn't going to peel off. So here it's baked. And then I'm adding the next piece of the saddle, which is the saddle flaps. And then I just make sure those are glued down. And then in these I cut a little groove because in real life the girth is laying over the top of this part, but I obviously didn't want to bulk it up too much, so I'm just doing this. Again, you don't see this, it's just me being extra. And now I'm just building up different parts of the saddle just to make it a little bit more lifelike. Not that saddles are alive, but you know what I mean. And then here's some more liquid clay, just so I'm adding the breastplate, which is attached to the girth at this point. And I'm just putting it across the front of the horse and then looping it back up to join on the other side. And now here's the outside part of the saddle, the main saddle flaps, and I carve a little detail in, push them into place, and then I just trim them to fit as I made them a little bit big. In polo, the saddle is set very far forward on the horse compared to regular saddles up on the withers, and this creates a different centre of balance that's required for the amount of agility that is needed to play polo effectively. Now I'm using a Q-tip to buff the clay to look like leather, and then I'm making sure it's well stuck down by adding in some liquid clay, and I added some little blocks in there as well just so it wasn't floating. And then I'm using my knife to remove a little slit, and this is where the edge of the overgirth slides underneath the saddle flap out of the way of the rider's leg, although not all polo saddles have this. And then I'm just adding some stitching detail with some thick layers of clay softener, and then I'm adding on some little tiny metal details, which is a D-ring and then a little stud as well. And I add it on both sides, and then try and blend as much as I can before baking, and then I'm adding some little trims on after it's been baked. And then onto the next layer I add a base for the saddle seat, and I just want to sculpt it so that when you look down from the back of the horse, the gullet, which is the channel that runs between the two sides of the saddle, I want it to look neat. And then I was adding on a little trim, and then the top of the breastplate, which goes over the top of the withers, just in front of the tuft that I sculpted earlier. And then I'm adding on 2 little buckles, and I knocked the camera there, just pretend you didn't see that. And then making sure it's all attached with liquid clay, the moment of truth with the tiny little buckle, and then stabbing in some holes for adjustment. Obviously this isn't going to be adjusted, but we can pretend. And then I just add on some little keepers. And then do everything again on the other side, doing some keyhole surgery. More holes. And then the keepers. And then at this point I add the base of the overgirth, which is just a thinner girth that keeps the saddle stable on the back of the horse. And then add some keepers on there as well, because even though the reference pictures didn't have them, I didn't like the idea of the girth sliding back and pinching the horse, because obviously I have feelings for inanimate objects. And here I'm bulking out the saddle, smoothing everything into place, and then trimming off extra clay so I don't make it too bulky. I do this a lot, as you can tell. And then here I'm starting to shape out the cantle, which is the back of the saddle. Smoothing it all into place so it looks like it's all made out of one piece. And then add a little bit more onto the pommel. The pommel is very slightly higher than the cantle on a polo saddle, so I just wanted to make sure I got this right. I found that adding a layer of liquid clay helps to create a smooth surface in the oven as well. And now with a different type of clay, a flexible one that cures without fully hardening so it can be slightly bent, I'm adding on the skirts of the saddle because I want to be able to lift them to add the next details underneath, which is why I'm putting a piece of paper there so that when I bake them they don't stick together. And then here I'm adding a little bit of piping detail around the edge of the skirt. Most English style saddles have a little rivet on this part of the skirt. And then here's me starting to create the overgirth. So again, I used a piece of paper as a template. I remove the piping details to reduce bulk, and then I leave that for later. So using the same flexible clay, I'm adding more rope details to the rope halter, and this piece is going to be hanging, so it needed to be flexible so that it wouldn't snap off. And I added in one of those little rings that I made earlier. Just please ignore how shaky my hands are. And then here I'm creating some little stirrups out of the flexible clay that I'm going to bake beforehand, so that I don't mash them around when I'm sculpting them onto the saddle. Here they are baked, and I'm adding them onto leathers, and then, like I said before, I'm lifting the skirt up a little and popping them underneath into the crevice I made when I put the saddle flap on earlier. And then I'm using lots of liquid clay to make sure they are fully stuck. And then here's the tail of the stirrup leather, and then I'm popping it into this keeper that some saddles have, where it goes all the way through the leather. Some of them just let rest on top, but I imagine that this would be beneficial for a polo player, as there's a lot of swinging of mallets around and you wouldn't want anything else hanging free. And then I think now I'm popping on the overgirth, and I use the end of a tool just to mash them into the little holes that I made quite early on. And I wanted to make sure they looked like they joined up with the slightly smaller girth that I put on the base of the horse, and I think they do quite well here. Now, overgirths are usually made out of either leather or elasticated linen, so here I'm putting on some more texture because I thought it would be nice to have that contrast, since the saddle we made of leather too. And after doing this, I realised I needed to widen out this panel part of the saddle, which is fortunate that I left a bit more space on the saddle blanket to accommodate a bit of extra bulk. Of course, I repeat this on the other side as well, but I really needed to keep this video concise because it was really getting quite long, as you can tell. Just adding some little creases for detail, and then on the back I wanted to put a little plaque. Some cantles do have a little plaque nailed onto the back. And then just adding a little bit of tread to the stirrup. And then traditional Argentine polo blankets have a very distinctive pattern on them, and some of them have these tassels that come off the bottom, so I wanted to make sure I could add as many details as possible, and so I made these tassels. And the plan is to paint the pattern onto the saddle blanket later on. Just give them a little bit of shaping so they look a bit more like tufts, and then I'm working back on the halter again. I had a reference of a polo halter on my computer, so I was just sort of copying that because I've not seen one in real life, so I was just going off what I could see, and they don't tend to have any buckles or snaps, so it's just I think either rope or rawhide usually, and they have knots which are tucked into little grooves on the other side. And And here I'm making the end of the lead rope just by twisting together two very long pieces of the flexible clay, and then I drape it over the back of the horse and then attach it at the piece I just made with some liquid clay. And then, although I leave a long part of it dangling, I want to stick the rest of it to the horse so that it's frozen in motion. When I sculpt, I like to try and tell a story in one frame, so I hope that this sculpture appears like a horse that's just come out of a game and she's being untacked and she's just had a little bit of a drink and she's been sponged off, and she's just having a big yawn because she's quite tired. I'm doing some work on the hooves here. I just wanted to make sure they were nice and flat on the base. I didn't do any detail on the bottom of these feet, or three of them, because you won't see it. But I wanted to make sure that even down to the hooves, you know, a part that probably won't get much attention, still has plenty of detail and is nice and rendered, so it's not an outlier. I used some little pieces of foil just to stop them sticking to the base in the oven. And then once they were baked, I just wanted to carve out the base of this rested hoof, as I do sculpt a little bit of detail onto the bottom of that one. And then once she was out of the oven, I wanted to give the saddle a bit of a sand and check it was all lined up, and it looked really nice. And then at this moment I noticed that the billets weren't lined up, so I decided to cut it off and re-sculpt it. But at this point I realised that the whole thing was intact, so as a cheeky little shortcut, I decided to try and just stick it on, but slightly higher up, because I really didn't want to sculpt that again. Just trimmed it a little bit and then tucked it under the skirt like the other one, and then popped lots of liquid clay on to adhere it. And here I am just sculpting a little bit of the skirt on top. Popped on another little rivet and put her in the oven, and thankfully it worked. So here's the point where I realised I didn't like what was going on in the front legs, so I used my scalpel just to shave off some layers, and then I decided to add on some tendon boots, which is quite common as well in polo, and it helps protect the front legs from the player's mallet as they swing. I'm adding a little trim to the edge of the tendon boots with a very long, very awkward piece of clay. And then I've just added in some lovely clumsy shots of me attempting to do the other one. And then I'm adding on some straps onto the fronts. Again, I'm trying to keep everything really small because I don't want it to look too bulky or out of proportion from the rest of the leg, and I hope I managed to achieve this. And then with the flexible clay, I'm just popping on some ends of those little straps. Now, of course, I have to add some unnecessary detail to those straps. So back up onto the body, I've noticed that even though she's resting her leg on this side, it does look a little bit too low for the anatomy of the pelvis, so I added on a little bit more. And then I added a very small ridge just at the top of the tail, where usually when a horse is resting their leg, it protrudes a little bit. So I'm sculpting some details onto the forelegs, and at this point I do start to add some sort of thread veins. Now, when a horse is exercising, their veins do tend to pop out a little bit so the horse can cool down. And I wanted to try and depict this, but I do think that I took it a little bit too far. But I have seen other people using different types of clay products to sculpt these veins, so in the future I'll have to try those. So now I'm on the hooves again, working on the shoes, and I've put some more foil down to stop it from sticking again, and I just performed some kind of wizardry because I'm not really sure how I did this. I kind of blacked out, and I'm putting on some very, very small details here with my strange Frankenstein tool that I made. Slathering on lots of the liquid clay and putting the nails on. And it is kind of like trying to teach ants to stand in a line. I just had to poke them around until they looked right. And then of course I had to do the same on every single hoof twice. So I did that one at the front and now I'm on this back one. Instead of adding the toe clip onto the back shoes, I decided to do quarter clips, which is usually quite common. Since the anatomy of the rear hooves is slightly different than the front hoof. And then popping on some more of that liquid clay so that I can add the nails onto this one too. And now at this point I decided that a few of my reference photos had this polo blanket folded over with part of it sticking out the back, and I really liked how organic that looked, so I wanted to add that to my piece as well. So here I am just sculpting that out and popping some texture on it with some fabric again, and then of course I had to create more of those tassels. And because I wanted the little corner to flare out a little, I added the flexible clay just to add a little bit more dimension, and then I'm stamping it again. So I think this took about an hour, so instead of showing the entire thing I just wanted to speed through and show the main parts of the process. And then I'm working on the veins on the other side now. Again, I am not happy with the way they turned out. You'll see in the final piece, but I will probably sand them and scale them back before I paint, which will be in another video. So here I'm adding some thread veins to the face. I'm happy with these ones. I think they turned out a lot more realistic and subtle. Now I took this moment to work on the ears, as I hadn't given them much attention since right at the beginning, so I'm adding some little wrinkles where the top of the head collar is touching them, and because she's yawning the ears are perked up, which is quite a common pose, and so I have a good chance to sculpt the insides of the ears here, just some little delicate hairs here and there, but just enough detail to get it across. And then clearly you weren't allowed to see that part, but I added on some sort of strings of muscle onto the hind quarters, and my big hand was blocking the way. So I was just looking over my sculpture, and then here and there where I thought it was missing a bit of detail I was adding that on. I decided I wanted the breastplate to be wider because it looked a little bit skinny against all the rest of the tack, so I just made it wider with a snake of clay and then made some little buckles out of the flexible clay and just popped those on for a little bit of extra detail. Making sure to add the buckle holes. And here I'm adding my favourite part of the whole sculpture. I'm not sure why I like it that much, but I'm making a bucket and sponge. So I just made a little coil of wire just so that I could pop it into a drilled hole at the front so it wouldn't go anywhere. So I'm brushing it with liquid clay, and then here I am rolling out some flexible clay to make the walls of the bucket. Now I embed a sheet of foil inside because it gives it a little bit more rigidity and a bit of strength. And I just sandwich two pieces together with the foil in between. And then I paint some gluey bits on, and then there's some detail on the inside of the bucket that I just etched on before curling it around the little circle I'd made. And then once it was baked I could give it a nice sand. And I had to correct some of the weird lumpy bits that I'd made, and then here I am just filling up the hole that was left at the bottom. And so I'm using some bits of clay around the edge to create the lip, just making sure it's nice and blended. And then I did bake that again and gave it a quick sand, and then here I am doing some of the side details. So I rolled out some very, very skinny pieces of clay and just put them sort of on the inside of where the grooves I had made on the inside are. It's supposed to look like a tin bucket. I'm brushing it with lots of liquid clay, and then I brush the inside, and then my favourite part of the entire sculpture is this little stupid peanut shaped car sponge, which whenever I had ponies in the past I always had a stash of these for bath time. I really don't understand why I liked this that much. It was just, I think it was just because it was so different. I've never made anything like that before out of clay. It's so boring and mundane, I'm sorry. Right, so I baked that off, and then here I realised that I should have left some holes, so I made some little cuts with my knife and then popped in some little pins made out of wire. And then just using a stick to make sure they stayed straight, I put on some clay to sort of cover up the ends, and then blended them in so it looked like they were part of the same bucket. And then I just added some little rivets. And then here I am making the handle of the bucket. I just bent a piece of wire into the shape that I saw on my reference. And then I made a little handle, which is probably made of wood, and then just put some details in there, and then I attached it to the bucket. And then I added a very tiny little thread of clay just to create what looks like a seam on the tin bucket, and I put that on one side where the handle was. And just really tried to make it look like it was part of the same piece. And here it is, all baked. I tidied up the base on my bandsaw, and the sculpture is done. So the last thing to do now was to do a bit of prepping on the base to make it look like there was an environment around the horse. So I decided on some sort of sandy, dirty texture straight onto the wood with some liquid clay, and I used a mixture of my leftover clays, which included the horrible clay, I was glad to get rid of some of it. And then I punched the holes where all the wires go in, I didn't show it on the video, but the cocked leg where the horse is resting it, I did cut the wire off so you can't see it. So there's only 3 holes for the legs now, and then there's 1 for the bucket as well. And then I popped on some little circles for the stones, and then made this little tool to create little half moons to suggest that she's been shifting around as she's been stood there. And then I baked it in the oven, put everything together, and then all that was left was to paint a solid base coat ready for painting her in the future. I just want to thank you for making it to the end of my first video, and if you enjoyed it, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.